Have you ever watched an entire crowd decide someone's guilt before hearing a single word? The question would linger in countless minds long after that warm Saturday afternoon. But in the beginning, nobody standing outside the Riverside Market in Columbus, Ohio, seemed interested in finding the answer. They were interested only in what they thought they saw. Vanessa Holloway stepped out of the grocery store carrying 2 reusable shopping bags and a bouquet of fresh white lilies. At 34, she carried herself with quiet confidence, dressed in a light blue blouse, dark jeans, and comfortable sneakers, looking no different from anyone else finishing weekend errands. She smiled politely as she thanked the elderly cashier through the automatic doors, unaware that within seconds, strangers would begin recording what they believed was the downfall of a dangerous woman. A police cruiser pulled sharply into the parking lot, followed almost immediately by another. Tires squealed against the pavement as Deputy Owen Barrett and Officer Caleb Sutton stepped out with urgent expressions. Conversations around the entrance stopped. Shopping carts froze in place. Curious eyes turned toward the flashing lights. Before Vanessa could even understand why the officers were approaching her, Deputy Barrett called out in a firm voice, asking her to stop where she was. She immediately did, carefully setting both grocery bags on the ground before slowly raising her empty hands. The movement was calm, almost instinctive, but it did little to slow the momentum already building around her. Officer Sutton instructed her to turn around. Vanessa blinked in confusion. "May I ask what this is about?" she asked softly. No answer came. Instead, another command followed. She quietly complied, never raising her voice, never stepping backward, never making a sudden movement. Within moments, cold metal handcuffs clicked around her wrists. The sharp sound echoed across the parking lot with surprising force, as though announcing to everyone nearby that judgment had already been delivered. Gasps rippled through the growing crowd. Several people immediately lifted their phones, eager to capture every second. Some whispered that she must have done something terrible. Others confidently guessed she had been caught stealing or running from the law. A few parents instinctively pulled their children a little closer while staring at Vanessa with uneasy curiosity. The internet, one woman quietly muttered, would know the whole story before sunset. Vanessa stood perfectly still, her breathing steady despite the humiliation washing over her. She looked neither angry nor defeated. Instead, there was an unusual calmness in her eyes, as though she understood something everyone else had missed. That composure only fueled more speculation. Why wasn't she protesting? Why wasn't she crying? Why wasn't she demanding a lawyer or arguing with the officers? To many watching, her silence looked suspicious. To a handful of others, it looked heartbreakingly dignified. Near the edge of the crowd, Megan Whitmore lowered the phone she had instinctively pulled from her purse. Unlike the others, she wasn't focused on getting the best video angle. She found herself studying Vanessa's expression instead. Something about the woman's quiet patience felt strangely out of place amid the urgency surrounding her. It was a feeling she couldn't explain, but it stayed with her as another police vehicle rolled into the parking lot and more people gathered to watch. No one realized that the scene unfolding before them was only the beginning of a story that would soon force every witness to question not only what they had seen, but how quickly they had chosen to believe it. The flashing blue and red lights continued to paint restless patterns across the parking lot as the crowd grew larger with every passing minute. What had begun as a routine shopping afternoon was quickly becoming a public spectacle. Drivers slowed their cars instead of leaving. Customers abandoned half-filled carts near the entrance. Within moments, dozens of phones were pointed toward Vanessa Holloway, each recording a version of the story that seemed obvious before anyone knew a single verified fact. "She has to be dangerous," one man whispered loud enough for others to hear. "They wouldn't handcuff someone in public for no reason." Another woman nodded immediately, repeating the assumption as though it had already become the truth. Rumors spread faster than the flashing emergency lights. Some claimed Vanessa had assaulted an employee. Others insisted she had tried to flee. A teenager live streaming the scene confidently announced to his viewers that police had caught a violent suspect. None of them actually knew why the officers had stopped her, but uncertainty rarely traveled as quickly as certainty dressed up as confidence. Vanessa remained standing exactly where Deputy Owen Barrett had positioned her. Her wrists were secured behind her back, yet her shoulders stayed relaxed. She neither pleaded nor protested. Instead, she quietly looked across the crowd, meeting the eyes of strangers who had already begun judging her. Their expressions varied from curiosity to fear, from excitement to satisfaction. Few saw another human being. Most saw only a headline unfolding in real time. Officer Caleb Sutton spoke briefly into his shoulder radio before stepping a few feet away to receive an update. Deputy Barrett remained beside Vanessa, maintaining a professional posture without saying much. His expression revealed little, but inside, the pressure of performing every action under dozens of recording phones was becoming impossible to ignore. Every movement, every word, every decision would soon exist online, frozen forever outside its full context. Near the front of the crowd, Megan Whitmore could not shake the uncomfortable feeling growing in her chest. She had originally lifted her phone to record like everyone else, but now it remained lowered at her side. Vanessa's behavior simply did not match the image people were eagerly constructing around her. She had complied immediately. She had spoken respectfully. She had not argued once. Megan quietly wondered why someone supposedly dangerous appeared calmer than nearly everyone watching her. An elderly veteran standing nearby noticed the same thing. Crossing his arms, he softly muttered, "Most guilty people I've seen don't stand that still." His observation went largely unheard beneath the endless stream of speculation surrounding them. Every few seconds, another bystander arrived, immediately asking the same question. What happened? The answers they received were never facts. They were guesses repeated so often that they sounded convincing. Before long, those guesses became accepted reality inside the crowd. Vanessa listened without interruption. She heard herself described as reckless, violent, unstable, dishonest, and dangerous by complete strangers who had never spoken to her before that afternoon. The words stung, but she refused to let them change her expression. She had learned years ago that dignity sometimes meant remaining silent until the truth had room to breathe. Suddenly, Officer Sutton returned after finishing his radio conversation. His face looked noticeably different from only moments earlier. He leaned toward Deputy Barrett and quietly shared a short update that immediately caused the deputy's confident expression to tighten. Barrett glanced back toward Vanessa, then toward the police cruiser, before asking Sutton to verify the information one more time. It was a brief exchange, barely noticeable to the crowd, yet Megan caught the hesitation instantly. For the first time since the officers had arrived, one of them looked uncertain. The spectators continued filming, completely unaware that the first tiny crack had just appeared in the story they believed they were witnessing. While everyone else remained focused on the woman wearing handcuffs, the real turning point had quietly begun inside a conversation no louder than a whisper. Deputy Owen Barrett asked Officer Caleb Sutton the same question twice, not because he had failed to hear the answer, but because he wanted to be certain he had not misunderstood it. Sutton quietly repeated what dispatch had just told him. The information attached to the original call did not fully match the woman standing in handcuffs before them. There was enough similarity to justify the initial stop, but enough difference to demand immediate verification. Barrett's jaw tightened. Procedures required certainty, not assumptions, yet the parking lot around them had already turned certainty into a public performance. Vanessa Holloway noticed the brief exchange without trying to interpret it. She had spent the last several minutes listening to strangers invent stories about her life. Some insisted she had robbed the store. Others claimed she had attacked someone in the parking lot. A few confidently described crimes that had never happened, each version growing more dramatic as it passed from one person to another. She closed her eyes for a moment, took a slow breath, and reminded herself that panic would solve nothing. The truth had not changed simply because people had begun believing something else. Megan Whitmore continued watching from only a few yards away. The hesitation she had noticed in the officers was becoming impossible to ignore. Deputy Barrett no longer looked completely certain. Officer Sutton checked his tablet again before speaking into his radio once more, this time asking dispatch to confirm several identifying details. Their voices remained calm, but their body language had shifted in subtle ways that most spectators completely missed. The crowd, meanwhile, remained absorbed by the spectacle rather than the facts. Every new arrival asked, "What's going on?" And every answer sounded more confident than the last despite coming from people who knew nothing. A local delivery driver announced that police never handcuffed innocent people. Someone immediately agreed. Another person added details that had never occurred. Within minutes, complete strangers had unknowingly built an entire fictional narrative around a woman whose only confirmed action anyone had actually witnessed was quietly following every instruction given to her. Near the store entrance, the manager stepped outside after hearing the commotion. He glanced toward the officers, then toward Vanessa, trying unsuccessfully to understand why his customers had abandoned their shopping to gather around the patrol cars. Several employees joined him, equally confused. None of them identified Vanessa as someone who had caused trouble inside the store. Their puzzled expressions contrasted sharply with the certainty spreading through the crowd. Megan noticed that contrast immediately. If something serious had happened inside, why did the employees appear just as surprised as everyone else? She slipped her phone into her purse. Recording no longer felt important. Understanding did. She slowly walked closer, remaining behind the police perimeter while quietly observing every conversation she could hear. Deputy Barrett approached Vanessa again. His tone remained professional, but it had softened almost imperceptibly. "Ma'am," he said, "I'm going to ask you a few questions while we verify some information." Vanessa nodded. "Of course." He asked for her full name, her date of birth, and whether she carried identification. She calmly explained that her driver's license was inside her shoulder bag, which was still lying exactly where she had placed it before being handcuffed. Barrett instructed Sutton to retrieve the wallet without disturbing anything else. Sutton carefully located the identification and compared it with the information on his screen. His eyes paused longer than expected. He looked once at the license, once at Vanessa, then back at the tablet. The descriptions did not fit as neatly as they had only minutes earlier. Without saying anything, he handed both items to Barrett. The deputy studied them in silence while another radio transmission crackled through the speaker clipped to Sutton's shoulder. Dispatch had found additional information connected to the original report. Barrett listened carefully, his expression growing more serious with each passing second. Across the parking lot, nobody knew what the officers had just learned. They only saw two policemen standing over a handcuffed woman. The videos continued recording. The whispers continued spreading. Yet beneath the noise, the foundation of the entire incident had already begun to shift. The first assumption had survived only a few minutes. The first verified fact was finally beginning to arrive. The atmosphere changed so subtly that almost nobody noticed it at first. The crowd remained convinced they were watching the conclusion of a police arrest, while the officers had quietly begun realizing they might actually be standing at the beginning of an investigation. Deputy Owen Barrett stepped several feet away from Vanessa Holloway and spoke privately with Officer Caleb Sutton. Dispatch had confirmed that the physical description provided by the original caller was incomplete, and one important identifying detail no longer matched the woman standing before them. That single inconsistency was enough to slow every assumption they had made during the first few minutes of the encounter. Barrett requested another verification through dispatch, while Sutton carefully reviewed the incident notes line by line. Neither officer spoke loudly enough for the gathering crowd to hear, but their growing caution was impossible to hide from someone paying close attention. Megan Whitmore watched every movement with increasing curiosity. She had expected the officers to continue processing the arrest, yet instead they seemed to be asking more questions than giving answers. Something was changing, and she could feel it before she understood it. Around her, however, the public remained focused on creating its own version of reality. Several people continued streaming live. Comments flooded their screens as viewers from elsewhere confidently declared Vanessa guilty without knowing anything beyond a few seconds of video. Others criticized the officers for moving too slowly, insisting the woman should already have been taken away. Megan found herself wondering how complete strangers could speak with such certainty while possessing almost no information at all. Vanessa remained remarkably composed. Her wrists were still secured behind her back, but she neither complained nor attempted to defend herself against the rumors circulating only a few feet away. Every harsh word reached her ears. She heard herself called reckless, dishonest, dangerous, and manipulative. Yet she responded only by quietly watching the officers complete their work. Her silence was not surrender. It was patience born from the belief that facts eventually speak louder than fear. Deputy Barrett returned carrying Vanessa's driver's license. He compared the information once more before asking another calm question. "Miss Holloway, have you been here long today?" Vanessa answered without hesitation. She explained that she had entered the store less than 30 minutes earlier, purchased groceries and flowers, thanked the cashier, and walked directly outside before being stopped. Her timeline was clear, consistent, and delivered without uncertainty. Barrett nodded slightly before asking whether anyone inside the store might recognize her. "The cashier probably would," Vanessa replied. "We spoke for a minute while I was checking out." Barrett exchanged another glance with Sutton. Without delay, Sutton entered the supermarket to verify the statement. The crowd noticed him disappear through the automatic doors, but few understood why. Most assumed he was collecting evidence against Vanessa. In reality, he was searching for information that might either confirm or completely unravel the original report. Inside the store, Sutton spoke first with the cashier, then with the floor supervisor, and finally with the customer service desk. Each conversation added another small piece to a puzzle that no longer fit together the way Dispatch had originally described it. Employees consistently remembered Vanessa as polite, calm, and unremarkable. No one reported an argument. No one described threatening behavior. No one claimed she had caused any disturbance while shopping. Outside, Megan noticed Sutton reappear much sooner than expected. His expression had changed again. He walked directly toward Barrett without looking at the crowd, speaking quietly enough that only fragments of the conversation escaped. Barrett listened carefully before lowering his eyes toward the pavement for several seconds. His posture remained professional, yet the confidence of the initial arrest had noticeably faded. For the first time since the patrol cars arrived, he seemed more interested in verifying the truth than defending the decision already made. Vanessa noticed the shift as well, though she said nothing. She simply waited. The crowd continued whispering, filming, and speculating, completely unaware that the story they believed they were witnessing was beginning to collapse under the weight of ordinary facts. What had looked simple only minutes earlier was becoming increasingly complicated, and somewhere beyond the parking lot, the person who had started the entire chain of events had no idea that every new answer was leading investigators farther away from Vanessa and closer to an entirely different truth. By the time Officer Caleb Sutton returned from speaking with the store employees, the mood inside the police perimeter had become completely different from the mood outside it. Beyond the patrol cars, people continued sharing theories with absolute confidence. Inside the circle formed by flashing lights and yellow tape, certainty had quietly disappeared. Sutton approached Deputy Owen Barrett carrying a printed receipt the cashier had voluntarily provided after checking the register records. The timestamp matched Vanessa Holloway's explanation almost perfectly. Every minute of her visit inside the supermarket could now be placed within a clear timeline. More importantly, several employees independently confirmed that she had behaved politely from the moment she entered until the moment she left. Barrett looked at the receipt before glancing toward Vanessa again. She remained standing exactly where they had asked her to remain, her wrists still restrained, her expression composed despite everything that had happened. The deputy suddenly realized that the woman who had been publicly judged by dozens of strangers had never once raised her voice, complained about the inconvenience, or attempted to embarrass the officers in return. She had simply waited for facts to catch up with assumptions. Another radio transmission interrupted the silence. Dispatch had reached the original caller for additional clarification. As Sutton listened carefully, his expression slowly changed from concentration to disbelief. The caller admitted that the report had been based largely on a brief glimpse from across the parking lot. The individual had described clothing, approximate height, and the direction someone was walking, but could not confidently identify the person's face. Even more significant, Dispatch now reported that another witness believed the individual connected to the original complaint had left the area several minutes before police arrived. Barrett closed his eyes briefly. The foundation supporting the detention was becoming increasingly unstable. Nearby, Megan Whitmore noticed the officers no longer speaking with urgency, but with careful deliberation. She could not hear every word, yet she recognized one sentence clearly as Sutton quietly said, "We need to make absolutely certain before we go any further." That single sentence stayed with her. It sounded less like officers building a case and more like professionals trying to prevent a serious mistake from becoming even worse. The crowd, however, remained trapped inside its first impression. New spectators continued arriving, immediately filming Vanessa in handcuffs without asking what had actually happened. Social media notifications echoed from several phones as clips spread beyond the parking lot. Complete strangers online were already debating a story whose most important facts had not yet emerged. Vanessa looked across the faces surrounding her. Some people refused to meet her eyes. Others stared openly. A little girl holding her father's hand quietly asked why the woman looked so calm if everyone believed she had done something wrong. The father hesitated before answering, realizing he did not actually know. For the first time, uncertainty reached someone outside the police line. Deputy Barrett slowly walked toward Vanessa. His voice remained measured and respectful. "Ms. Holloway," he said, "thank you for your patience. We're still verifying information, and I appreciate your cooperation." Vanessa offered a small nod. "I understand," she replied softly. "I just want everything to be based on the truth." There was no anger in her voice. No sarcasm. Only quiet sincerity. Barrett found himself unexpectedly affected by that response. Years of experience had taught him that stressful encounters often produced shouting, accusations, or resistance. Instead, the woman before him seemed focused only on allowing the process to reach the correct conclusion. At that very moment, another patrol unit arrived carrying a supervisor requested earlier during the verification process. After receiving a concise briefing, the supervisor examined the available information himself, reviewed the updated dispatch notes, compared the identification details, and asked several careful questions that neither Barrett nor Sutton had considered during the initial response. His final question changed everything. "Has anyone actually confirmed that Ms. Holloway is the person connected to the original complaint?" Silence followed. No one answered immediately, because no one honestly could. The parking lot suddenly felt quieter than before, even though the crowd had grown larger. The truth, hidden beneath layers of assumptions and public judgment, had finally begun to emerge. What everyone had treated as an obvious arrest was no longer obvious at all. For the officers standing closest to Vanessa, one realization became impossible to ignore. They were no longer trying to prove they had detained the right person. They were trying to determine whether they ever had. The question hung in the air longer than anyone expected. Has anyone actually confirmed that Ms. Holloway is the person connected to the original complaint? The supervising officer looked from Deputy Owen Barrett to Officer Caleb Sutton, waiting for an answer that never came. Neither officer attempted to fill the silence with excuses. Both understood that the investigation had reached a decisive moment. Procedure demanded certainty, and certainty no longer existed. Barrett slowly exhaled before speaking into his radio one final time, requesting every available update from dispatch. Seconds later, the response arrived. Another caller from a nearby business had reported seeing a woman matching the original description leave the area in a different direction several minutes before officers arrived at the supermarket entrance. The description was more detailed than the first report and included clothing that no longer matched what Vanessa Holloway was wearing. The timeline also aligned with the receipt from the grocery store, making it increasingly difficult to place Vanessa anywhere near the reported incident. The supervisor carefully reviewed every piece of information once more. There was the receipt showing exactly when Vanessa had completed her purchase. There were multiple employees confirming her calm behavior inside the store. There was the updated witness statement pointing toward another individual. Piece by piece, the picture became impossible to ignore. The woman standing in handcuffs had become the focus of a misunderstanding that had expanded faster than the facts themselves. Barrett walked toward Vanessa with measured steps. Around them, dozens of phones remained raised, still expecting drama rather than resolution. The deputy paused for a brief moment before speaking. "Ms. Holloway," he said quietly, "based on the information we now have, we are no longer able to confirm that you are connected to the incident that was originally reported." Vanessa looked at him calmly. She had been waiting for those words without ever demanding them. Barrett continued, his voice steady but noticeably more restrained than before. "We're going to remove the handcuffs." Officer Sutton stepped forward and carefully unlocked the restraints. The metallic click echoed across the parking lot just as loudly as it had when the cuffs were first secured, yet this sound carried an entirely different meaning. Vanessa slowly brought her hands forward, gently rubbing her wrists without anger or theatrical emotion. She simply took one slow breath and lowered her arms to her sides. Something extraordinary happened next. The crowd that had spent nearly an hour whispering, recording, judging, and speculating became almost perfectly silent. Conversation stopped in mid-sentence. Several people quietly lowered their phones. A few looked away, suddenly uncomfortable watching the woman they had so confidently condemned only minutes earlier. Megan Whitmore felt a knot form in her throat. She replayed the entire afternoon inside her mind and realized how easily assumptions had replaced evidence. She had resisted joining the loudest voices, yet even she had initially believed the officers probably knew something everyone else did not. Standing only a few feet away from Vanessa now, she understood how quickly ordinary people could become part of someone else's humiliation without ever intending to cause harm. Deputy Barrett faced Vanessa directly. "I want to thank you for your cooperation," he said sincerely. "I also recognize that this situation has been difficult." Vanessa offered a gentle nod. "I know your job isn't easy," she replied. "I only hoped the truth would have enough time to catch up." Those words settled over the parking lot with greater force than any raised voice could have achieved. No accusation, no anger, no attempt to embarrass anyone. Just a quiet reminder that truth often moves more slowly than judgment. Even the officers remained silent for several moments after hearing her response. The flashing emergency lights still reflected across nearby cars, but the atmosphere had completely transformed. The spectacle was over. What remained was reflection. Around the edge of the crowd, people began slipping their phones into their pockets. Some quietly walked back toward their vehicles without saying a word. Others exchanged uneasy glances, recognizing that they had witnessed not the arrest of a dangerous suspect, but the public humiliation of an innocent woman whose greatest act throughout the entire encounter had been refusing to let fear speak louder than dignity. The silence that filled the parking lot was no longer the silence of curiosity. It was the silence that arrives when an entire crowd realizes it has judged far too quickly. The flashing lights were switched off one by one, but the weight of what had happened refused to disappear with them. The patrol cars remained parked near the entrance as Deputy Owen Barrett stood quietly beside the supervisor, watching people slowly drift away from the scene. For nearly an hour, the parking lot had echoed with whispered accusations, confident assumptions, and the constant sound of phone cameras recording a story that now looked painfully different. No one seemed eager to replay those moments anymore. Vanessa Holloway picked up the 2 grocery bags she had placed on the pavement before everything had unfolded. The bouquet of white lilies remained untouched, though a few petals had scattered across the asphalt after being brushed by passing feet. She carefully gathered them without complaint, placing the flowers back together as though restoring something fragile that deserved care rather than pity. Megan Whitmore instinctively stepped forward. "May I help you?" she asked softly. Vanessa smiled with quiet gratitude. "Thank you," she replied. "I think I have everything." There was no bitterness in her voice. That simple kindness caught Megan completely off guard. She had expected disappointment, perhaps even understandable anger. Instead, Vanessa responded with the same calm dignity she had shown from the very beginning. Nearby, Deputy Barrett approached the supervisor after completing the final incident documentation. "Everything points to an incorrect identification based on incomplete information," he admitted. The supervisor nodded. "We'll complete the required review," he answered. "What matters now is making sure every detail is documented accurately." Barrett understood exactly what that meant. Every decision made during the encounter would be examined carefully, not because anyone had intended harm, but because public trust depended on learning from moments exactly like this. Officer Caleb Sutton quietly gathered the remaining paperwork while glancing toward the crowd that had almost completely dispersed. Several people had deleted the videos they recorded. Others simply walked away without speaking. Yet Barrett knew that some recordings would remain online, showing only fragments of the encounter without capturing how dramatically the truth had changed. That realization weighed heavily on him. A short video could preserve the image of handcuffs forever while never showing the moment they were removed. Across the parking lot, Megan finally introduced herself to Vanessa. "I'm sorry for everything you went through today," she said sincerely. Vanessa looked toward the nearly empty entrance of the supermarket before answering. "What happened today wasn't easy," she admitted. "But I hope people remember something more important than what they recorded." Megan frowned gently. What's that? Vanessa looked around the parking lot where strangers had stood only minutes earlier. That every person deserves enough time for the truth to arrive. Megan remained silent, realizing those words carried far more weight than any speech could have. They were not directed at the officers alone. They were meant for everyone who had watched, judged, commented, and assumed. Deputy Barrett overheard part of their conversation while walking toward his patrol vehicle. For the first time in years, he found himself replaying an encounter not because of what had happened, but because of what almost continued happening if the investigation had stopped too soon. He thought about Vanessa's cooperation, her patience, and the remarkable restraint she had shown while complete strangers discussed her life as though she could not hear them. Professional experience had taught him to make quick decisions. That afternoon reminded him that quick decisions always required equally careful verification. Before leaving, Barrett walked back toward Vanessa one final time. "Miss Holloway," he said, "I know today cannot simply be undone, but I do appreciate the way you handled an incredibly difficult situation." Vanessa nodded respectfully. "I appreciate that you kept looking for the facts," she answered. "That's what made the difference." Barrett offered a quiet thank you before returning to his cruiser. As the last patrol car slowly exited the parking lot, the ordinary sounds of the shopping center gradually returned. Shopping carts rolled across the pavement again. Families resumed loading groceries into their vehicles. Children laughed near the entrance as though nothing extraordinary had happened. Yet for everyone who had witnessed the afternoon from beginning to end, something had changed. The memory they carried home was no longer about a woman placed in handcuffs. It was about how easily appearances had persuaded an entire crowd, and how one person's calm dignity had quietly exposed the cost of rushing to judgment. 3 days later, the parking lot was quiet again, as though nothing unusual had ever happened there. Customers walked in and out of Riverside Market carrying groceries. Children laughed beside shopping carts, and traffic flowed normally through the intersection. Yet for many people who had witnessed the incident, the memory refused to fade. The videos recorded that afternoon had continued circulating online, but something unexpected had happened. New recordings had appeared as well. Longer clips showing Vanessa Holloway's calm cooperation, the officer's careful re-examination of the facts, and the moment the handcuffs were removed. The complete story had begun replacing the incomplete one. Comments that had once rushed to judgment slowly gave way to reflection. Some viewers admitted they had formed opinions too quickly. Others wrote that seeing the entire sequence had reminded them how dangerous partial information could become. Megan Whitmore watched those conversations unfold with mixed emotions. She had originally recorded only a few moments herself, but chose not to upload the footage. Instead, she wrote about what she had personally witnessed from beginning to end. She described how assumptions had spread faster than facts, how Vanessa had remained composed under extraordinary pressure, and how the officers had continued verifying information even after public opinion seemed convinced the case was already solved. Her words received thousands of responses, not because they were dramatic, but because they were complete. One afternoon, Megan received a brief message from Vanessa thanking her for choosing accuracy over attention. They agreed to meet for coffee at a small neighborhood cafe. When Megan arrived, she found Vanessa sitting by the window with the same quiet smile she remembered from the supermarket parking lot. Nothing about her suggested someone seeking sympathy or recognition. She simply looked like an ordinary woman enjoying an ordinary afternoon. "People keep asking if I'm angry," Vanessa said after they had spoken for a while. Megan looked up. "Are you?" Vanessa stirred her coffee thoughtfully before answering. "I was hurt," she admitted. "But anger would have allowed that afternoon to define who I became afterward. I don't want one difficult day to decide the rest of my life." Megan sat quietly, recognizing the strength hidden inside such a simple sentence. Most people expected justice to end with proving someone innocent. Vanessa seemed to believe true justice also included refusing to let bitterness become permanent. Meanwhile, Deputy Owen Barrett attended a routine departmental review of the incident. The meeting focused less on assigning blame and more on identifying lessons. Supervisors discussed the importance of continued verification, careful communication, and resisting the pressure that public attention could place on fast-moving situations. Barrett openly described the moment uncertainty first appeared and how essential it had been to continue checking the available information instead of relying on the original assumptions. Officer Caleb Sutton added that every encounter carried a responsibility not only to act, but also to reassess whenever new facts emerged. Their willingness to examine the incident honestly earned quiet respect among their colleagues. The experience became part of future training discussions, not because it represented intentional wrongdoing, but because it demonstrated how easily incomplete information could shape public perception. Weeks later, Vanessa returned to Riverside Market for the first time since the incident. The cashier immediately recognized her and warmly welcomed her back. Several employees smiled as she walked through the aisles. Even customers who remembered the event greeted her politely, no longer seeing the woman from the viral videos, but the neighbor they had overlooked before. As she finished shopping, Vanessa purchased another bouquet of white lilies. This time, she carried them through the automatic doors without flashing lights, without raised voices, and without strangers surrounding her. Standing near the entrance, she paused for a moment and looked across the same parking lot where so much had changed. She realized respect had not been restored because she demanded it. It had returned because the truth had finally reached the people willing to listen. Some apologies had been spoken aloud. Others had been expressed only through quiet smiles and lowered eyes. For Vanessa, both were enough. She understood that dignity could never be taken permanently from someone who refused to surrender it, and that the strongest victories were often the ones achieved without ever raising a voice. Months passed, but every now and then someone would still recognize Vanessa Holloway from the video that had once spread across thousands of screens. What surprised her most was not being recognized. It was how differently people remembered the same afternoon. Some remembered the flashing lights. Others remembered the handcuffs. But those who had stayed until the very end remembered something else entirely: the silence that followed when the truth finally replaced assumption. Vanessa never tried to erase what had happened. She understood that difficult moments become part of a person's story, whether they welcome them or not. The important question was what those moments would ultimately teach. One Saturday morning, nearly 6 months after the incident, Riverside Market invited members of the community to a neighborhood appreciation event. Families gathered in the parking lot where local organizations offered health screenings, children's activities, and food donated by nearby businesses. It was impossible for Vanessa to stand there without remembering the fear and uncertainty she had experienced on that same pavement. Yet the atmosphere now felt completely different. Children chased balloons where patrol cars had once been parked. Neighbors greeted one another with laughter instead of whispers. As Vanessa walked toward one of the booths, she unexpectedly saw Deputy Owen Barrett speaking with several families about community safety. Their eyes met briefly. Barrett walked over with a quiet smile. "Good morning, Ms. Holloway," he said. "It's nice to see you again under much better circumstances." Vanessa returned the smile. "I was thinking exactly the same thing." Neither of them mentioned the incident immediately. They spoke instead about ordinary things: the weather, the event, the number of local families attending. Only after a comfortable pause did Barrett quietly say, "I've thought about that afternoon many times." Vanessa looked at him with calm understanding. "So have I." Barrett hesitated before continuing. "Every officer hopes to make the right decisions. That day reminded me that the responsibility doesn't end with making a decision. It continues with having the humility to question it when new facts appear." Vanessa nodded thoughtfully. "And every person watching has that responsibility too," she replied. "Not only those wearing a badge." Barrett smiled softly because he knew she was right. The lesson belonged to everyone who had stood in that parking lot, phones in hand, convinced they already understood the entire story. Nearby, Megan Whitmore overheard part of their conversation while helping organize donated supplies for the event. She reflected on how differently her own life had changed after witnessing the incident. She had become more careful before believing headlines, more willing to wait for complete information, and more aware that every viral video captured only a fraction of someone's reality. Looking around the gathering, she realized many other people had quietly learned the same lesson. As the afternoon continued, the event organizer invited several community members to briefly share stories about kindness and understanding. To Vanessa's surprise, she was asked whether she would like to say a few words. She hesitated before accepting. Standing before a small crowd, she looked at faces filled with curiosity rather than judgment. I don't want to be remembered as the woman who wore handcuffs, she began gently. I'd rather be remembered as someone who believed the truth was worth waiting for. The audience became completely still. Every one of us will someday be misunderstood about something, she continued. When that day comes, I hope the people around us choose patience before conclusions, questions before accusations, and compassion before certainty. No dramatic applause interrupted her words. Instead, a quiet wave of understanding moved through the audience. Some people lowered their heads thoughtfully. Others smiled through moist eyes. Even Deputy Barrett found himself reflecting on how a single afternoon had permanently reshaped the way he approached both his profession and the people he served. As the sun slowly began to set, Vanessa left the event carrying another bouquet of white lilies. She paused for a brief moment before walking across the same parking lot where strangers had once decided who she was without knowing her name. This time, there were no flashing lights, no raised voices, and no cameras pointed in her direction. Only ordinary people living ordinary lives. She smiled quietly, knowing that justice had not simply restored her reputation. It had restored something even more valuable. The reminder that dignity does not depend on public opinion. Truth never loses its value simply because it arrives later than rumors. And the strongest measure of any community is not how quickly it judges, but how willingly it listens when the whole story is finally told.